Well, what a great morning of worship we have had so far, and it is so good to be together. And as Keith mentioned earlier, it's fall break week. We've got a lot of people traveling, and so all of you who are traveling on fall break and have stopped to join us in worship, we appreciate you. We miss you. We hope we see you really soon. I am not the regular guy that does this if you're visiting. I am the associate and discipleship minister here. Jason is away on a well-deserved break, but today we are going to continue in the series of sermons that he's been doing called Boundaries. And this has been a very helpful, very practical series of lessons that I think all of us have been able to glean some sort of gift from, to be able to place it in our hearts, to learn about what healthy boundaries really look like. And what he's really taught us, if you've missed the first couple of weeks, what you've really missed is that healthy people have healthy boundaries. They provide us with safety, and they provide us with security, and they provide us with ways to say no. And so on the screen right now are the three principles of developing healthy boundaries that we've been going over the past couple of weeks. And what I want to encourage you is, if you've missed any of those, up there on the screen is a QR code. You can scan that. It'll take you to our YouTube page, and go back and watch those lessons that you've missed, because these are some of the most practical lessons that I think every single one of us can benefit from. But if you've missed any of those, go and watch those in your spare time. Share those with people. Let them know what's going on here at Mayfair. So over the next few weeks, what we're going to do is we're going to look at how we set up and practice using boundaries in a couple of different areas: in our families, as parents, and in our marriage relationships. But today, what we want to do is we want to kick off looking at these ways of applying boundaries by looking at something that every single one of us needs to look at, and that is practicing self-boundaries, personal boundaries. And I want to start this morning by looking at Romans chapter 7. If you have a Bible, you want to turn to Romans 7. It's a very short passage we're going to look at here. And here what we're going to do is we're going to learn a very simple truth, okay? And that is that the majority of the time, our worst enemy can be ourself, okay? So here in Romans chapter 7, looking at verse 18, this is from the New Living Translation. It says, "I want to do what is right, but I can't. I want to do what is good, but I don't. I don't want to do what is wrong, but I do it anyway." And then skip down to verse 21. It says, "I have discovered this principle of life, that when I want to do what is right, I inevitably do what is wrong." Is it just me, or does that sound like something out of a kid's book? You know, any of you ever feel this way? This passage in Romans chapter 7 is such a good starting point for understanding the need for self and personal boundaries. Self-boundaries apply in so many areas of our lives. It applies to things like what and how much do we eat, or how much money do we spend and how do we spend it. It applies to balancing our work life and our personal life and the rest that we get. Saying the right things. The list can go on and on. There are so many areas in our own personal journeys that we need boundaries. And this morning, what I want to do is I want to look at a few steps that we can all take to begin establishing strong personal boundaries. These are going to be very simple, very practical, and very needed in our lives as we look at how to develop strong personal boundaries. And what that will do is it'll build toward healthy boundaries with both ourselves and with other people, as we will learn about over the next few weeks. The first area of this is a simple one that I think is probably often overlooked, and that is we need to learn to speak the truth to ourselves. Or in other words, we have to be honest with ourselves. The first step in establishing personal boundaries is starting right there, is being honest with ourselves. Where do you need help establishing boundaries? What exactly is it in your life that you need to look at and say, I really need some help here? When was the last time you did a self-check, did a test on yourself to determine areas where maybe you were struggling, where you needed help? You know, it's not fun at all to stop and evaluate your own life and try to look at your shortcomings. Because sometimes that's a really hard thing for us to look at and realize. It's not fun to see areas of your life that maybe aren't as healthy as what you would like for them to be. But it's so very important to do that. My brother passed away a few years ago from the effects of severe sleep apnea that was left untreated for the majority of his life. He never wanted to wear the CPAP mask that he was prescribed while he slept. And eventually it just took such a toll on his heart that it took his life. A few years ago, when I was preaching in Tampa, Florida, I began to really start to struggle with my sleep as well. I was never fully rested. I would toss and I would turn, and my wife would tell me that I would snore through the majority of the night to the point where she wasn't getting any sleep either. And while I thought I was just fine, she told me that I needed to go to the doctor and get this checked out. And being a very stereotypical male, I said, no thanks, I'm fine, I'm good, I don't need to go to the doctor. I'll just roll over on my side. I'll be fine. Well, I was sitting in my office one afternoon. It was about 1:30. I had found myself really struggling to stay awake. And this wasn't the first time. It had been happening for months. Middle of the afternoon, when I should be completely rested and ready to tackle the rest of the day, I found myself really struggling to stay awake. And it wasn't because I had just eaten a large chicken pot pie and I was tired, okay? It was because I was not sleeping well at night. So I got up and I walked down to the restroom and I splashed some cold water on my face to try to refresh myself and to get a little bit more awake. And that's when I looked in the mirror and I noticed that I had these giant, heavy bags under my eyes. And I looked at my face and it just looked like it was 20 years older than what it was. And I looked so incredibly exhausted. So I went back to my desk and I texted my wife and I said, I think it's time to go to the doctor and get this sleep study done. Because I knew what sleep apnea had done to my brother, and I didn't want to have that same result happen in my life. Sure enough, after the sleep study was done, I was diagnosed with obstructive sleep apnea, and I, along with many of you in the room, I want to ask for a show of hands, joined the CPAP club. And every night now, I get rest. And I wake up in the morning and I feel refreshed. And I'm ready to go. And I don't fall asleep at 1:30 in the afternoon, but instead I'm rested throughout the entire day. And it all started with a moment of being completely and brutally honest with myself. Until I could stop and see the damage that I was causing to my own body by lying to myself, saying that I was fine, that I was getting the rest that I needed, nothing was going to help me. And if someone had forced me to go and do that sleep study, there's a good chance that I would not have believed the results, and therefore would have never gotten the CPAP and never given it a chance. But when I started by being completely honest and truthful with myself, it completely changed my attitude. Not everybody struggles with the same thing. All of us, however, struggle with something. And when we are honest and truthful to ourselves, we can then identify different areas of our lives that need structure or limits. Areas such as finances, relationships, the use of electronics, a daily routine, your physical health, the nutrition that you give your body, the emotional health that you sustain, and so on and so forth. I want you to see if any of these scenarios sound familiar to you? You find yourself going through a drive-through on the way home from work before dinner because you're craving some sort of junk food, because you've had a really bad day. And you find yourself getting a full meal. You hide it from your spouse, you hide it from your family, you hide it from your friends, and then when you get home, you go ahead and you eat a full dinner on top of that. You find that you just can't stop the emotional eating. Or maybe you find yourself irritated and grumpy because you haven't had your nicotine fix for the day, and the last few hours even, and you find yourself always jumpy and on edge far too often. Or maybe you find yourself really stressed and your self-esteem is kind of shot, and you just don't want to deal with this mental battle that's going on in your head. So instead, you reach for the alcohol to numb that constant voice in your head. Perhaps you find yourself with too much month left at the end of the money because you care more about how people perceive you instead of providing for yourself and your family, and you've spent all of your money on stuff that doesn't matter. Maybe you never have time for yourself because you give all of your time away and you give it to others, to other people, and to their needs instead of your own and your own family. Or maybe you find that when it comes time for intimacy with your spouse, you've lost the desire because you filled that need with pornography or in the arms of somebody else. All of these areas and many more are areas in our lives where boundaries need to be firmly placed. But until we are honest with ourselves that there needs to be a boundary there, we're never going to do it. No amount of nagging, no amount of concern or help from someone else is really going to help until we can stop and be truthful and honest with ourselves. It's like what Paul said in Romans 7. I know what I need to do, but I don't do it because there's a strong and aggressive force trying to keep me from fixing it. We need to look at these struggles that we have in our lives and realize that the only way we're going to move past them and claim victory over them is to meet them head on. Figure out a plan and keep them subdued. Self-boundaries begin by taking a long look at your life and being honest about the things, areas where you've crossed the line. Or to look at our example from Paul again, knowing what you need to do, but this time instead of letting the evil or wrong option linger, we place things in between ourselves and that option to remove it. Another step in establishing self-boundaries is this. It's be kind and fair to yourself. Well, have you ever done something like this? You decide you're going to start a new routine. It could be a new diet, or it could be a new exercise regime, or it may be a new contemplative practice where you're going to start a prayer journal or Bible reading. And you get prepared and you write out a plan and you go shopping for healthy food. And then a few days after you start whatever this new routine is, you mess up. And instead of doing some exercise and eating a healthy snack, you go straight home, you sit in a recliner for 12 hours, you eat 3 bowls of ice cream, and you use your prayer journal as a coaster. You ever done something like that? And then what you do is you become your own worst critic. And you begin to tear yourself down, and you convince yourself that after this one mistake that you've ruined any and all chances of ever starting new and fresh and doing something new in your life, and you give up completely. I think that happens to most of us. You see, self-boundaries need to be realistic and they need to be achievable. But there also needs to be some room for flexibility as well. It's really counterproductive to expect perfection and then blast yourself for not holding firm to these new boundaries that you want to put into place. Because when you struggle with a boundary, you need to be gentle with yourself. You need to not be too harsh, not be too unrealistic and put yourself to shame. You see, when we set goals or boundaries, we have to have realistic expectations of ourselves. And if you set that bar too high, you're going to crash and you're going to burn. And when you mess up and you slip up, and you need to adjust your boundaries, and you need to make sure that you improve that plan. Another thing about that is don't try to set too many boundaries at once. A lot of us, whenever we start to impose these self-boundaries, we put so many into place that there's no way we're ever going to be able to follow all of them. Setting boundaries is a process. Try making small changes at once instead of making all the changes at one time. A third step in establishing these healthy personal boundaries, as you see on the screen here, is to stop playing the comparison game. Stop playing the comparison game. I think this one may be one of the hardest ones in establishing personal boundaries, because this is a game that all of us find ourselves playing at one point or another. You are living your own life, not someone else's life. We have to create boundaries that reflect our own goals and our own values. And when we start to play the comparison game, it can wreak havoc in our mental stability and happiness. I want you to know that Satan loves it when you start to compare yourself and your life to other people, because he wants to convince you that everyone else has their lives put together. And he wants to convince you that everyone else has it all figured out and that their life is so good, they've just got it on cruise control and they have no problems. And they're not worried about how life is going to turn out or how things are going to be in their lives. That's what Satan wants all of us to think. When I was young, every summer, my father would take on a few extra jobs so that we would have enough money to go on a vacation. It was very important that my dad always took us somewhere during the summer. That was something his parents always did for him and something he always wanted to do for us. And usually it ended up being a trip to a beach somewhere, and most of the time it involved tent camping, and that was a sight to see because my mother hated tent camping. But that's what we would end up doing most of the time. And one summer, when I was really young, we ended up borrowing a small pop-up camper to go on a trip to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. The problem was we didn't have a truck to pull the pop-up camper. All we had was an old Ford Fairmont. It was very small and very impractical and could not tow anything. So we ended up borrowing my grandfather's truck to go on this trip. Now, I want you to understand something. This is in the mid-'80s. And when I say borrowed a truck, the trucks then were not what we have today, these nice, giant, four-door, spacious trucks, okay? This was not very big at all. In fact, it was a compact truck that we went on. It was very similar to this truck right here. Now that looks all well and good, except for the fact I want you to understand that there were 5 of us that were going on this trip. Only 2 doors with 1 bench seat. So guess where me and my sister and my brother all sat on this trip? In the back, under the shell, in the bed of the truck. So I was around 7 at the time, which would have made my sister about 11 and my brother about 15. And we embarked on this trip from Lebanon, Tennessee to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, which is about a 600-mile, 9-hour trip one way. Meanwhile, I had classmates at school who also went on vacation. And they were telling me about how they were flying to their vacation, or they were driving in their nice big vans, and they were going to go stay in a hotel and have a really grand time, not worrying about how they were going to get there. But we sat in the back of a compact truck for 9 hours, stayed in a pop-up camper, and by the way, that was the year that a few things just did not go as planned on our vacation. This was the vacation where we had a raccoon get into our camper. It was also the vacation where I had a flock of geese chase me, and while I was running away, I lost one of my flip-flops, and my family just stood there and laughed at me. I could have been eaten by those geese, okay? And I would have given anything at the time to be in a different family that had money, that could afford to stay anywhere else but that pop-up camper, without a raccoon, without geese, In fact, I could stand up here right now and spend 30 minutes talking about all the catastrophes that we had on our family vacations, but I'll save you the details. But here's the deal. Here it is 40 years later, and I remember just about every small detail about that vacation. I remember the pain of riding in the back of the truck with my brother and my sister, yes. And I remember the raccoon in our camper, I'll never forget that. And I remember being chased by these ginormous geese and losing my flip-flop with my family, cackling like ducks all over on the side at me. But I also remember in great detail going to an all-you-can-eat shrimp restaurant while we were on our way to go see the USS North Carolina battleship. And I remember swimming in the ocean, and I remember staying up till the wee hours of the night playing Uno with my family in the camper. You see, it might be tempting to compare yourself to others. You see, people on social media always seem to have things better, don't they? But that's because we tend to share and post the best and the happiest things in our lives, not the struggles and not the heartaches. And while it may be tempting to enter into an undeclared and unknown battle with the Joneses, it's not a really healthy place for us to be. The other thing about that is this: even if you achieve the thing that the Joneses achieve, guess what happens? You'll find someone else who has an even better life, a nicer car, a nicer home, that takes an even more extravagant family vacation, and something else that you will continue to covet. In order to set up proper self-boundaries, the only person you can compare yourself to is the previous version of yourself. How do you continue to move forward? See, we have to focus on living a life that is congruent with our own values, with our own goals, with our own reality. And what someone else is doing with their life has zero bearing or weight on what you do with your life. Don't look at someone else's life and think they've got more opportunities, or they don't have to worry about, or I wish I only had what they had. Stop the comparisons and focus just on you. There's one final step I'd like to encourage you all to think about in establishing self-boundaries this morning. And this is one that I know a lot of us need to hear, and that is to know and honor your limits. Back in April, we had a small leak in our kitchen, which turned into a small disaster for us. And on June 14th, our kitchen was torn out, and we've been without a kitchen since then. And after dealing with insurance and general contractors and subcontractors, it's just been such a big headache. The other day, I was talking to my general contractor. I was texting with him to ask him for the phone number of one of our subcontractors that I was supposed to get in touch with. And he took a screenshot of his phone to send me the number that I needed. And as soon as I saw it, I knew why it had been so challenging to talk and to work with my general contractor for the last 4 months. I want to see if you can see the reason why it was such a problem to get in touch with my contractor. If you look down at the bottom of that screen under voicemail, you see that number? 118 voicemails. I didn't know that was possible. I didn't know your phone could store that many. And so I look at that and I think, well, no wonder. I mean, I know that contractors work really hard. I know that they're overworked and they take on a lot more work than they ever need to take on. But this seemed really excessive. And I know that there's a few people in here like that as well. People who try to be everything to everyone. People who try to please everyone, but in the process, you make yourself vulnerable to spreading yourself too thin. We all have a finite amount of energy and a finite amount of time. And we have to guard those very carefully. We can't give them all away to others. And if we're not careful, we'll give ourselves completely away to helping other people and working out their problems, helping them with their needs or their desires. And by the end of the day, we're too exhausted to deal with our own problems and to help with our own family. Now, hear me out. I am not telling you to avoid doing extra things in your life. That's not what I'm getting at. Continue to volunteer at school. Continue to help your neighbors. Continue to do kingdom work with your church. Those things are all extremely important. But where we where a lot of us go is we struggle to know our limits and how much we can do. We need to know that it's okay to volunteer to help for just one afternoon at school instead of all 5 afternoons. We need to know that if our neighbor says, "Can you help me cut my grass?" that you can do that one time and not commit to doing it all summer long. We need to know that if you volunteer to teach the children at church, you do it for a summer quarter and not also the winter and the spring and the fall. There's an example of someone in Scripture overextending themselves found in Exodus chapter 18. We're not going to take time to read all of this passage, but this is a passage where Moses has discovered that he has overextended himself. In short, Moses was not only leading the people through the wilderness to the promised land, but he was also spending a lot of time doing extra things. And one of those things was spending time playing the role of judge for the people. The Scripture says that he would spend from morning until evening listening to their disputes and helping them sort through their problems. And Jethro, his father-in-law, he looks at this and he says, this isn't good. You're wearing yourself out. You're doing too much. So he suggests that Moses take some time and teach others what he's doing and then delegate some of those responsibilities. Moses needed a better boundary with regard to his time and his energy. He needed to admit that he couldn't do it all and that he needed help. Another area where you can see this happen is in the life of Jesus. Jesus knew how important it was to impose boundaries for his physical and mental well-being so that he could have a healthy life. There's a story in Matthew chapter 8 in verses 23 through 27 where the disciples are on a boat on the Sea of Galilee. And while they're on this boat, there comes a large storm that appears. And while the storm is going, the boat is being tossed about to and fro. And the disciples are really, really scared. In fact, they start shouting out, "We're going to die. We're not going to make it." And all the while, Jesus is asleep. So the only thing they can do is what they think of in that moment. They wake Jesus up, and Jesus gets up. And even though the Bible doesn't say that he says it this way, I feel like Jesus probably mumbled under his breath, "Why are you afraid, you of little faith?" And I imagine the disciples, after the storm is calmed, and after they collect their thoughts, a few minutes after they marvel at what Jesus has done, I think they probably said, "How on earth was he sleeping through that?" Because that's what I want to know. But if you look back, all you have to do is look at what Jesus had already done that day. He had healed a leper, followed by many others after healing that leper. He healed the centurion's servant. He healed Peter's mother-in-law. He cast out demons and spirits. And then in Matthew 8:16, a very inclusive statement, it says he healed all who were sick. It doesn't give us a number. It just says all who were sick. And then he even talked to people about the cost of discipleship. So yeah, I bet Jesus was pretty tired. But Jesus knew how to deal with these things. He established boundaries so that he could have time to recover. I want you to look just real quickly at these passages to see some of the things that Jesus started to do to impose self-boundaries and know his limits. Because these passages right here all talk about how he spent time alone with the Father in prayer, withdrawing from the crowds, withdrawing from his friends, withdrawing from the people who needed him 24/7 so that he could have time to be by himself. He knew when it was time to get away from the crowds and when he needed strength from his Father. He knew when he needed alone time with God and needed to rest and to prepare for the day and to recover from the things that he had gone through. When we embrace our limits, it does not mean that we slip into a comfort zone and are unwilling to do things. It also doesn't mean that we pass up opportunities. Embracing your limits means that you know yourself well and that you understand your limitations and that you're going to lean upon the Lord for discernment. It means you're not going to compare your journey, your schedule, or your capacity for work to anyone else. It also means that you're going to keep track of the amount of rest that you get each day. It means that you're going to take care of yourself physically and mentally. It means that you're going to say yes to the things that matter most to you. When we push ourselves to the limit, the busyness of our lives ends up stealing all of our joy. It can destroy our faith. My wife and I were talking about this the other night. We discovered that some people make busyness an idol in their lives, using it to kind of prop themselves up, maybe as more important than others, or that they have a better sense of work ethic than you. But in reality, what I discover is it's often a false sense of security. That a lot of times we believe that by staying busy and doing all of these things, that it's going to insulate us from grief or families struggling or a financial heartache or disappointing health diagnosis. And we use this busyness to cover up other things. So how about you this morning? Are you ready to start placing boundaries in your life? Because it all starts with self-boundaries. Are you ready to be truthful and honest with yourself about where you need these boundaries? And are you ready to stop comparing your life to others and the things that they're going through? And are you ready to recognize that you have limits in your life, that you can't be everything to everyone, and that you can't do it all? These are just a few areas where we need to start in placing self-boundaries in our own lives. Perhaps this morning, the single best boundary that you can put in place is the one that is provided by being in the security of being in Jesus Christ. This morning, if you don't have Jesus in your life, if you're not giving your life over to Him, that's the best place to start, because putting Jesus in your life, by being washed in the blood and by relieving yourself of all the sins and the mistakes and the struggles in your life, He can help establish those firm boundaries so that you can start living the life that you want to live. If you need any of those things this morning, we'd love to pray for you and talk with you. Let's stand and let's sing.